Yeah,
He's back.
I'm back. That's right. Vivian, your background disappeared.
Yeah, I didn't like it.
Vivian.
kept giving me a pinhead.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Looking forward to seeing you all in less than a week. Holy cow! Yeah, it's the lab program is upon us, and what we're going to do tonight is wanted to do the Power of Place lecture that we always do. And for those of you all that are new, welcome to the expedition family. Looking forward to meeting you all, and everybody else looking forward to having you back. This program is going to be really a fun one because we're much like we often do with the lab programs. We're focused on the artifacts from the preceding season. So in this case, a lot of times in past programs, when we were excavating the South Yard, Dolly's Midden, we had focused on the ceramics and mending those. Well, as you all know, for this past season, we've been doing sites of labor. And Carol, your background is most appropriate with all the iron behind you, because that looks about what we've been finding at the site. So especially that what looks to be a horseshoe back there. Where'd you get that background, Carol?
It's actually all silver.
It's all silver.
Hoard. It's a Viking hoard from the Curdale Valley in the UK.
Okay, well then I take it all back. We found nothing like that. I wish we did. If we were finding that kind of silver in the home farm, we'd have some real problems with interpreting.
Yeah. Everything would
be a lot of questions being asked. But it looks close enough to iron for me. We'll run with it. So, but with the Power of Place lecture, what we usually do is, I always ask folks about, what Power of Place means. But before we get into that, I wanted to make sure that you all were all set for the program, because I know that a number of you might not be able to attend the entire length of the lecture tonight, just in case. But does everybody have all the materials that Melissa sent you? And Melissa is here tonight, which is great. Hello, Melissa. Melissa started as our program coordinator earlier this season, and she, like Sarah Lee, is also she's been a guide at Montpelier for many years. And so, Melissa, are you giving the house tour this time?
No, it's going to be Tessa's restoration tour instead.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Very cool. And Melissa, I get if folks haven't done a house tour, because we have several new people, would they be able to do a house tour on Sunday afternoon? Is that a possibility?
Well, I sent out an email a while back asking you all as a group if anybody was interested, and I hadn't heard. If you've changed your mind, if any of you want to do it, I'll be glad to put aside a ticket for you. Is there anybody that would like to do that? Because you'll get an exhaustive tour of the house inside with Tessa.
Mm-hmm. And we'll make up for the
good. Okay.
Good.
All right. Going once, twice, pass. Thanks, Melissa. Well, when you think of Power of Place, I know a number of you, have already, thought about this for Montpelier, but always interested in hearing what you all have to say about it. What do you all think of when you think of Power of Place for a historic site like Montpelier, or any place that that's had some history in the past?
Okay, I'll talk.
Yay, thanks, Debbie.
Well, and I'm going to say the same thing that I have said the last however many times we've done this is those is just there. To me, there's something special about being at the location where something happened or somebody lived, and just being able to reflect on you know, what happened there or what the people were, and just, I guess it's all, to me, it's always very special when something exists that was there, you know, 200 plus years ago.
Mhm.
Wait, hang on, I've got a cat going. Get down.
Okay.
Okay, come on.
Yeah, basically that power of place is what the history has in terms of what was there in the past. And like at Montpelier, for so many of our sites that we're doing, you know, today it's a field. And in fact, the home farm, much of it is a field. But when you do the excavations and you find the evidence for, in this case, the past buildings, the sites of labor that was there, whether it was a blacksmith, a farrier, a tobacco barn, it just makes that space come alive in terms of the meaning it had. And for, you know, for a lot of what we find at these sites, it's the artifacts that do it. And the artifacts are what gives it the power of place. And that's a really important part of what this week, you know, next week is going to be with you all is, you know, those artifacts are how we understand what happened at these sites. You know, if you just found a foundation to a building and there were no artifacts, you know, is no matter how well preserved that foundation was, without, you know, those telltale artifacts, you wouldn't be able to say whether it was a domestic site, a blacksmith, a storage shed. And we're going to be doing over the week is, you know, looking at how we caretake for those artifacts, how we identify them. And the conservation is a really exciting part of this program with all the iron that we've got out of the ground. What else comes to mind? And there's no right or wrong answer for this. It's all right answers for power of place. You know, it's different perspectives. Yeah, Peggy. Oh,
I want to say this without droning on too long, so stop me if I do, but
We will.
okay, good. There's something about physically being in a place that it sounds spiritual and woo-woo, and I don't really mean it that way, but that's the way I feel it, that it just makes it makes the stories and it makes the readings, the data, it makes all that come alive. I see every trip that I come back to Montpelier, I learn a little bit more that helps me put in perspective, not just what I've learned about American history that I now know, like most of us, that, whoa, boy, do I have to relearn. Because what we were taught was really, really messed up in so many ways. And there were so many holes, so many things that weren't talked about. So every time I walk away from there, then it really helps me when I go home. And home, I live in Florida, but I grew up in Kentucky, and my parents grew up in a little town where everybody they were all tobacco farmers. They came there from Maryland as tobacco farmers in the late 1790s. And when I was growing up, being 65 years old, I caught the tail end of that culture. And a lot of people in my family lived a long time. This past year, they're just dropping like flies. This year, I've lost so many people in my family, but I've had the privilege, the joy of being able to pick their brains and talk to them and walk with them and ask questions that I didn't know to ask, that now I know to ask because of Montpelier, because of my experience there. And I feel like maybe I can pass this on to the next generation in my family, and maybe others who are interested at all, some way, somehow. Does that make any sense?
yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's all
it's the
about
power of
connection.
that place, to me, opens up things in my brain and hopefully in other people's brains. And I think that it's very important that we spread this. Very important.
Yeah, and that idea of the stories and their connection to place and giving it meaning that's one thing that want to have you keep in mind with the the discussion we're going to have tonight on the history that we figured out from the archaeology of Montpelier, is that, you know, what I'm talking about tonight with some of the pictures of the archaeology we've done and what we've discovered, these are all places that you're going to be seeing next week.
Yeah.
And many of you seen them many times before, but when you think about it in terms of, you know, what's there today and what was there from what we found with the archaeology and those past archaeology sites, they're gone today because we've dug them up and we backfilled them. So we'll never be able to recreate those archaeology sites again. And that's why we do all the recording that we do. But they document what was there. And even when we do a reconstruction of these sites, it's not exactly what was there that we've been able to figure out through the archaeology. So it gives you, you know, the one thing that I really like about the Power of Place is that mind's eye view of what we think was there versus what we have today versus potentially what was there. Like if we go in a time machine and see that spot, you know, in the past. So try to imagine in the lecture, you know, what, you know, for those of you that have been to Montpelier, what those places are today and what they look like. But then also, you know, for those of you that it'll be your first time at Montpelier, is having a little more understanding about the landscape. So when you go out there, you'll be able to, you know, have a different view of just not just what is there that you see, but what we've tried to figure out about the past. And that, you know, and this is all one version of the Power of the Past. And we could talk more about this, you know, after the talk tonight. But does anybody else have anything else to add?
Find it fascinating to go there and you get to walk the same ground that these people walked on.
Yeah.
You sort of kind of get into what was their mindset? What was it like for them?
Amen.
How is it different for them than it is for me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
And even different from each other, you know, depending whether it was, you know, Mr. Madison or an enslaved individual, how they would have seen the landscape differently. So, all right, well, cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share screens at this point and get into the PowerPoint. And yeah, so everybody can see my screen now with a map up there. So what I wanted to give is a background is, you know, how archaeology has helped us understand what's here at Montpelier. And a big part of it, what's here, you know, that you see immediately is the main house. And that of course represents, you know, the home of James Madison. But so much of what we find, and you know, the star there is, you know, where the main house is at the 22,650 acres that make up Montpelier. That's the white line that goes around the property mass there. So much of what we find at Montpelier, you know, I'd say 100% of the sites we find were created and used and you know, represent the lives of the enslaved. So even in the main house, you know, who was serving the food, who was creating the trash deposits that ended up going outside, it's all the enslaved community. So it's a reflection of the work that these enslaved Americans were doing at the behest of the Madisons. They really produced the physical landscape that we see today. And so that's where, you know, what we've gotten into is what we term these sites of labor. And this ranges everything from, you know, the homes of enslaved that we found from the archaeology. So this picture right here on the left is a picture of excavations in the South Yard. And I'll get into that in a little more detail in a few minutes. And then what we've reconstructed based on the archaeology of those homes. And the same where we've been working for the past, you know, 2 years out at the home farm is the homes for enslaved farm workers and artisans. You know, there's, you know, a very different set of archaeological deposits, just these subfloor pits with no evidence for the buildings in terms of foundations. And we've been able to figure out these are these log structures that were out there. And for these sites of the domestic sites, you know, what we find is that's this array of ceramics and glasswares, tobacco pipes, a whole range of items. But when you get into the sites we've been working on more recently, the sites of labor, these are barns, stables, in many cases like a tobacco barn, and what's left there is a much lower density of artifacts in many cases, and it's very, very well comparable to some of the fields that are out there that that make up the woods today and some of the pasture at Montpelier. The entire landscape was a site of labor. Pretty much what we found from LIDAR and metal detector surveys, every inch of the land at Montpelier was used in some way, whether it was for growing tobacco or grains. And the buildings that we're looking at all supported that activity. I'll talk a little bit about the formal grounds at Montpelier tonight. And, for the past 20 years, we've been looking at those sites, the South Yard, the area of the stable, everything that supported the entertaining that the Madisons did and their lifestyle. But the sites we're working on at the home farm, which are all below the visitor center, these are all supporting either the work that would happen in the fields or the processing of the crops. And so, it's a very different set of sites, and we're finding, a very different set of artifacts there that you all would be looking at next week. And the importance of these to Montpelier for establishing power of place is, we want to do a full-scale restoration of Montpelier, not just the main house, but all the working parts of the grounds, the plantation. And then also we've got a lack of documentary records for this. I mean, in many cases, a lot of the labor that happened was never recorded. But in the case of Montpelier, so many of the documents at Montpelier were destroyed in the 1850s when the wayward stepson, John Payne Todd, had collected all the family papers at his house. And when Madison's nieces and nephews went there, they found, all these private documents of Mr. Madison, and decided that there was too much information that would not reflect well on Mr. Madison. So they burned all these papers. And so with that went, lists of slaves, ledger books for the plantation, everything you'd want to understand what this place looked like and was like. And so what's great is, though, the archaeological record still bears testimony to that, because no one ever suspected that what was in the ground would ever be going back and scratching around with trowels to figure out what happened there. And so Carol, what you have behind you, that Spanish hoard with the silver hoard, that's what, back in the day, most people, when the thought of archaeology came up, it was doing archaeology on that sort of context, not finding a bunch of rusty nails in the ground and then figuring out what happened there. And, the information that comes from those rusty nails in some cases, is producing crops that were just as valuable as all that silver hoard that is behind you. And so it has, a very different value today, but it's something that we reflect on. And in the next week, we're going to be, talking about, Mary will be talking with you about how the artifacts that you all are working on reflect this history in a very different way than the kind of glitzy artifacts that you'd think about, at many archaeology sites. So with this, one thing that makes Montpelier really special is, you get the Madison era, from the 1720s through the 1844, but the next, 180 years were just as important in terms of all the preservation that happened from, when after Dolly Madison sold the plantation in 1844 through the DuPont period. You get pretty much not a lot of development at Montpelier. You go from over 100 laborers down to about 25. Fields are abandoned, they turn into woods. And then when the DuPonts buy the land in the early 20th century, they don't need to make money off of plowing the fields and cutting down the woods. They leave them as they are. So we've got this incredibly well-preserved record of the Madison past. And what we've been doing to find this is, there's the visitor core right there. What we've been doing is about 4/5 of the land mass is original Madison land. And we've been doing metal detector surveys all across this land. Everything that's in green, yellow, and red here, these shaded areas that popped up, that's where we've done metal detector survey. And I'll get into more about this later, But what we've been able to discover with the metal detector survey is, the presence of historic sites everywhere. And when you combine that with the LiDAR surveys, it gives you a really good indication of just how intensively used all this land was. And so, for example, for the home farm area, we've been looking at basically this little area right here in the visitor core, but this home farm served all of the land mass that you see in this area. Any crops that were grown all across here was being processed at the home farm right in this area. So there's a lot of activity that was happening here to support, this plantation, and the sheer volume of materials we found this past season that bears testimony to that. So with some of the history, one thing that we, when we start finding these sites, we want to know what time period they're from, because every single time period has a very different production history. You go from the early Madison period under Frances Madison, the grandmother. She was mostly having her slaves work the land as a tobacco farm. And so this was, the typical slash and burn horticulture of the time period. And over at the home farm, we found one site that's a tobacco barn, but it's much later. It dates to the 1820s, about 80 to 100 years after Frances Madison was running the plantation. And this, for the early ownership of Montpelier under Frances Madison, she really influenced what happened at Montpelier, because when she was running Montpelier as a tobacco plantation, her son, James Madison Sr., who was the father of the future president, he was beginning to have the main house at Montpelier built. And so what we found is, by the time Frances Madison dies in 1761, James Madison's parents, this is James Madison Sr. right here, her son, and his new wife, Nellie Conway Madison, they begin diversifying the farm. They're not only have a blacksmith operation that's up by the main house, but they also begin plowing of fields. So Madison is having his slaves, the blacksmiths, they're making plows, they're making wagons. So he's developing some of the newer agricultural techniques for the region under, with the knowledge that the enslaved that he owns have of the landscape. And what they're able to do by the time of the American Revolution is they're selling grains to Europe. And this is really basically solidifies the economic underpinning of Montpelier. So by the time that James Madison Jr., the future president, starts to take over the operation of the plantation in the 1790s, it's not a plantation that's in debt. It's got, 3 different lines of income, from tobacco, grains, and then also selling blacksmith items to the local community. And so when Mr. Madison first marries Dolly Madison, they end up adding this duplex addition onto the house. And what he starts to play around with his slaves is scientific farming. And all during the retirement years, while they're changing the grounds for entertaining with the addition of the wings on the house and completely revamping the grounds, and I'll get into this in a second, all across the plantation, they're also changing how the farming occurs with doing contour plowing and experimenting with threshing machines, all these early 19th century innovations. And a lot of these we begin to see evidence for at the home farm. And so a lot of the things that you'll be conserving relate to this period, which is the retirement years. So a very different, economic base for the plantation. And what happens to all of this is, by the time that James Madison dies in 1836, this is when Dolly Madison moves back to Washington, D.C. She moves back to D.C. in 1737. And then by 1844, she figures out that the plantation is so much in debt that she sells the entire plantation along with all of the enslaved community. And within about 4 years after Dolly sells the plantation, all of the outbuildings, all the home farm that we're looking at is completely removed from the landscape. So basically, a lot, the artifacts you're going to be processing in the lab, we can positively identify as being from the Madison era, because there's such a massive change in 1844 with Dolly selling the plantation. So it just makes these artifacts that much more informative for what we're trying to do with Montpelier. Now, following the sale of Montpelier, the area that's the home farm down here, all that is abandoned. And the area where you're going to be working next week over at the archaeology lab, which is today the mid-19th century farm complex that goes all the way into the DuPont period, is all this area in red. And so you'll be getting to know this area very, very well. And a lot of the outbuildings, we'll talk about some of the buildings that are out there when you're here next week. These are all DuPont era buildings, because during the DuPont period, this is when much of this area was developed even more. I don't think what's really interesting about the home farm is during the period of the Civil War, where we've got so many sites. I mean, we've got dozens of Civil War sites all across the property. And these are everything from summer camps that are just loaded with bullets and military items to the winter encampments that, where the troops were intensively occupying some of the areas. Well, we've got all these Civil War troops. In the metal detector surveys we've done of the home farm in this area right here, Dennis has found two Civil War artifacts. He found a, oh my goodness, I think it was a Union button last week, and then a Confederate Gardner button or Gardner bullet back when we were surveying the blacksmith shop. But it gives evidence that by the time you get to the Civil War, all the buildings of the home farm are gone. Because if there were buildings at the home farm, they would have been used by Civil War soldiers, and there would have been, Civil War artifacts all across this area. So it really speaks to, giving more evidence that all these buildings are gone by mid-century. And then all during the DuPont period, the later 19th century with subsequent owners into the DuPont years, the home farm is pretty much just used as fields. It's used as pasture, and there's a swimming pool and tennis court complex the DuPonts build in that area. And when we're out there, Chris is going to give you a tour of the home farm on Monday morning, and you'll be able to see a little more of the sites that that we've been working on for getting the artifacts we're looking at next week. But for the house itself, I mean, that's the thing that had the biggest change in the DuPont years. You go from the 19th century house with the low one-story wings to having the house tripled in size. This picture I love. This is the back of the house. There's the colonnade. And with the DuPont additions, that colonnade gets kind of sucked into the mass of this house. And this is what the house looked like when I started at Montpelier in 2000. And we got some gifts from the DuPont, or from the Mellon family, ironically, to take the wings, DuPont wings, off the house and bring the house back to its early 19th century appearance. So by the time we get to 2006, this is what the house looked like. And we began work on doing the excavations to understand what the formal grounds looked like. And actually right now, what we're doing is, it's in 2022, this is the 20th anniversary from when we started the restoration of the house. And we recently got a grant to digitize all of the work we've done at the main house. And on Thursday, I'm going to be showing you all this digitization project and how, if you're interested, you can help out with it. So this is some of the stuff you're helping out with, Peggy, with the IMLS project, the MAP, Montpelier Archaeology Archive project. We're digitizing all of the old excavations into GIS and then making that available on the public domain using the GIS server that we have. So all of these units right here, Peggy was actually involved in digitizing these. This is the front yard, and then putting all that information into GIS. And we'll show you the site where we're at next is the North Kitchen, which was in the Madison's day, where there was a kitchen underneath this DuPont building. And we did excavations there in this 2009 season. And I'll show you some of this in a second. But for the front yard excavations, this was a set of excavations that we did based on some of the few documents we have that recorded what the front appearance of the house looked like with this front fence. And we literally found these fence posts in the form of post holes in the ground with the charred remains of the post that the enslaved workers charred, so that insects wouldn't infest it. And for the enslaved individuals, you know, probably the incentive of figuring how to preserve these posts meant is that they didn't have to go back and repair them when they rotted. And so this is where, you know, looking at, you know, how the labor fits into this. You know, there's the formal grounds that look, you know, beautiful in their appearance, but what went into making those and maintaining those? And these are the questions that the descendant community have really asked us to begin to answer. Is, you know, these sites, you know, the power of place. You know, for Madison, the power of place was showing off this geometric landscaping on the ground. What did the power of this place mean for the enslaved community? You know, how was it different? Was the power of the place more along the lines of the work they had to do and the oppression that represented? Or was the power involved in the decision-making that they were a part of in creating this landscape, and the power that gave them with Mr. Madison in terms of knowing how all this, you know, how the repairs would happen and making themselves, you know, in many ways invaluable. So maybe they wouldn't be sold when the estate went into debt. You know, if you've got the intellectual mind, intellectual information about how things worked on the plantation in your mind, and you know that if you're hurt or you're sold, that information leaves with you. That's power that you have to control what happens to you on the plantation. Because so Dolly writes about this in the 1830s. She writes from Washington, D.C., that her personal slave, Sally, is stealing from her. And she says, I can't sell Sally because even though she's stealing from me, because no one else knows how to take care of me except for Sally. So Sally had power over Dolly Madison in terms of knowing what her needs were. So she knew she could negotiate this by taking things from her that she needed. And Dolly knew that she didn't have the power to sell Sally because she wasn't willing, you know, to start over with another personal slave. So this is where, you know, some of this sites of labor, it's more than just the labor, the hands, the labor that goes into it. It's that intellectual knowledge of how to do this work. And what's cool is the artifacts that we're conserving this week are ones like from the blacksmith shop that really, the form of those artifacts are the form that power took. You know, knowing how to make these artifacts at the blacksmith, that was a power that enslaved individuals, especially those blacksmiths, had of knowledge. And you know, it makes you begin to think about how else can we interpret these artifacts. They're not just like labor of like, you know, brute labor. It's what this intellectual basis was. And when you start looking at this landscape, you know, from the fence lines and how they're maintained, and today we're thinking about this because with restoring the front fence, we wanted to make it so that we didn't have to rebuild the fence. And so we used Zintox for preserving which is a toxic material for preserving the fence posts. But, you know, back in the day, it was a very different technique. But with all this, you know, we've done everything from restoring the front fence along the front, but replanting the pine alley and the grove. Many of y'all were involved in those excavations. We've got part of those spaces replanted. And then around the back of the house, we've got this massive trash deposit called Dolly's Midden, where we found all these imported porcelains from France and transfer wares from England. And so, you know, this is the typical kind of trash deposit you think of at a site. You know, all these piles of ceramics and glasswares. But what we're dealing with at the blacksmith shop, for instance, and you'll see this in next week, is all the slag that comes from there, all the byproduct of the blacksmithing. And actually up at the Dolly's Midden, where the temple is today, all this gully right here is underlaid by this massive deposit of slag from when there was an 18th century blacksmith shop up where the temple was built in 1811. So all this area was this slag deposit from this massive blacksmith shop dating to the American Revolution. And at that time in here, what we've got is there were slave hoarders in this area that created a whole nother set of deposits. So you've just got these layers upon layers of history at Montpelier that, you know, show these changes through time. So For the back lawn, the leveling of the back lawn, of course, is another site of labor in terms of not just the labor that went into creating that lawn with the leveling of this in the 18 teens, but then also the labor of the barbecues that would happen in the back lawn and all that was involved with that. And the folks that were involved in that were also doing work, in the garden. Terraced garden today was a vegetable garden back in the Madison period. And so all this contributed to the work that happened for entertaining visitors in the main house. And the people that were doing that work lived in what is the South Yard. So these buildings, the duplexes, the smokehouses, and the kitchen and the north dwelling. And we did extensive excavations in this area based on an 1837 insurance plat. And one of the first areas we excavated here was these duplex buildings in the South Yard. These are these central chimneys, the brick base and the stone base over here. And then you've got these buildings on either side that were about 4 families lived. And this next week, what you all are going to be doing is assessing some of the displays we have in the South Yard for the condition assessments. And this is going back and looking at some of the artifacts that we have on display in the South Yard in the Mere Distinction of Color exhibit. Everything from what's in the duplexes to what's in the work we did on the smokehouses. And then finally, the area that we excavated with the descendants of enslaved being the South Kitchen and the North Dwelling. So we'll be doing some work in the South Yard in terms of doing some curation work next week. But all this, led to this creation of an exhibit that we finally opened up last year when we were able to get out of figure out how to manage COVID. And so we're gonna be doing the regular tour of Mere Distinction, but you'll all be able to go behind the scenes of Mere Distinction and handle some of the artifacts that are in those displays. And this is part of, this curation theme that we're doing with the exhibit, with the program next week. Now for the home farm itself, you got the main house up here, and then all this area below the visitor center is where we found archaeological evidence of all of these buildings that are out here. I mean, when we started building the visitor center in 2002, the only thing we knew about this area is it was a pasture in the DuPont era, but didn't know anything about these buildings. And when we started doing metal detector surveys, we started finding site after site. And some of these we found, with the initial idea of putting in a parking lot and a road that would go from visitors would drive across this area and then park in parking lots down here and then walk up to the visitor center. That visitor center was going to be located further out into this area. And when we did this work, we started finding that not only were there, just a few buildings, but there was this entire complex that was out here. And so how we're able to figure out so much about this area is through metal detector survey. And the metal detector surveys that we've done all across the property is what we use to understand what's in the area of the home farm. So what we do in these metal detector surveys across the property is we would lay out the property on a 20-meter grid, which is about 66 feet by 66 feet. And each one of these tiny squares you see in here, these are a 20-meter grid. And then when we sweep each of these grids for artifacts, identify which are historic, and then do a hit count. And this is where we get this heat map, where you can see the yellow, orange, and red areas are where we've got sites. And then what's in green was more than likely fields back in the day. So where the agricultural crops are being grown. And you can see in the area of the main house and the home farm, you've got this hot area in here. And when you look at these areas, what most of these artifacts are that we find are nails. And the beautiful thing about the nails is, as many of you all know, is they date to the various occupation periods that relate to production at the plantation. So the wrought nails we get date to the Revolutionary War time period, where the blacksmith shop was up by the main house, and there was mostly tobacco farming happening, and then early plowing. And then these transitional nails are this middling period where James Madison Jr. is taking over the plantation. And then finally, the fully machine cut nails are during the retirement years. And even during the post-Madison period, we've got the face pinch nails. And from the work we've done at the home farm, we're actually finding more of these face pinch nails, and it's giving us a better understanding that these later machine cut nails potentially date to the late Madison era as well. And so we're, with the work we've been doing, we've been even refining our understanding of the nail chronology we have. But when you look at the home farm and blow this area up, what you can see is that you've got, these about, 7 or 8 major sites that show up in these red areas, like Mount Pleasant, the overseer's house, the blacksmith, and the field quarter. And much of these sites are, now that we've done the 10-foot surveys that we've done, we understand why the density is so high. Because in the case of Mount Pleasant, the overseer's house, and the field quarter, these are domestic sites where you've got lots of nails from buildings, but then also all other kinds of items like sewing items, buttons, things that would be associated with domestic activities. But then the blacksmith shop, I mean, you can imagine why there's lots of hits at a blacksmith shop. It's a blacksmith shop. There's iron galore. And what we've done to refine our understanding of these sites is going in and, we've been able to date the sites with the nails, but then with the metal detector surveys, these 20-meter grids are pretty extensive grids. And while they allow us to identify where sites are and aren't, what they don't allow us to do is understand where the buildings are. So with these 20-meter grids, once we find these sites, then we go in and lay in a 10-foot grid. And with this 10-foot grid, you get a much more refined reading of where the artifact concentrations are. So for this map right here, this 20-meter grid, there's sites all through this area, but it's not until you do the 10-foot that you can begin to see where the buildings are. So these red concentrations here. So in this map, what you can see is we're able to hone in on where to put our units. And in the case of the area in here, we put in units in the overseer's house, the blacksmith shop, and these 2 other buildings we found right here, the farrier's shop, and then the burn site up in this area. And when you look at this in terms of what the site would have looked like, you can go from these metal detector surveys to what we have assessed would have been here from the metal detector surveys. And this is a 3D imagery of what we think the home farm looked like. But what we're doing now is we're testing this hypothesis with actual excavation units. So in the case of the work we've been doing, we go from the metal detector survey to actually opening up units. So in the case of the overseer's site, this shot right here was taken in let's see, the end of the 2020 season. And you can see all the units we had opened up at the overseer's site. And what we were returning to next was the blacksmith shop. And this is what we focused on this past year. Started out the season with the blacksmith shop. And at the blacksmith shop, what we found was, with the metal detector surveys, these massive concentration of metal objects. And then when we opened up units of the blacksmith shop, one of the most spectacular units we found was this set of bricks that we think is the corner of the forge. And if you look at this video, let's see if I can get this video to come up. Yeah, here's the video, the drone shot flying into the blacksmith shop. You can see Terry down there directing the drone. And we're going into where this massive area of slag was with clipped iron, and that little pile of bricks is right here in this shot. And all this area was covered with this massive amount of iron scraps. But then inside where the brick foundation was, that's where we found all the slag. So if we go back to this shot right here, this area right here is right about in this area right here. And so with the blacksmith shop, what we found was, quite a mix of, items like hoe blades that have been cut into pieces and made into different things, horseshoes that were being forged into, say, chisels. It looks like this blacksmith shop in the 18th century or in the 19th century, they're, rather than making new items, they're either repairing items or refashioning old scrap iron into new tools. And so it's not the same kind of production that was happening up at the blacksmith shop all the way up at the main house in the 18th century. We're not finding a lot of bar iron like we were finding up at the temple. But what's unusual about the site, and this is a shot of all the one of the units with a massive concentration of blacksmith items, and I think Peggy and Debbie and Vivian, you might have remembered this unit right here with everything from spikes to these pieces of chain, and then all of these horseshoe nails. Like all these horseshoe nails in here are all these clipped horseshoe nails that are from used horseshoes, and it seems like they're pulling horseshoes, but they're not doing it, or pulling the nails out of horseshoes. But we haven't found a lot of clipped ends of horseshoes, like they were actually putting the shoes on horses at the blacksmith shop. And then what we've also found at the blacksmith shop are just massive amounts of slag. So there's a lot of production going on at the blacksmith shop. But then what we have also got is the farrier shop, that we don't know for sure whether it's a farrier shop or not. But why we called it a farrier shop is we were finding the clipped ends of nails from horseshoe nails that showed that there was actually reshoeing of horses happening down here. And this was in contrast to the blacksmith shop, where we didn't find as many of these clipped horseshoe nails. And so at the farrier shop, the final shot of these excavations, you can see here on the screen, and to give you a kind of a relationship, the blacksmith shop right here in this shot, we're looking in the opposite direction towards the cemetery. Overseer's site is here. The blacksmith site is over in this area with all the tall grass. And what we found in this bottomland was this area of just we found a stone foundation for a building, along with just this massive blackened deposit of slag in this area. And then what we were finding at the farrier shop was, in some cases, some whole horseshoe nails, and then also the tips of horseshoe nails, like this one right here. And also we were finding some different iron, like there's iron that appears to be completely melted. And one interesting thing about the farrier shop is it's located by what in the early 19th century, or I'm sorry, the early 20th century was referred to as a ram pump, which is a pump for getting water out of the ground. And Dennis, in doing the metal detector survey, he found down in this area a lead pipe that ran from the ram pump into the main part of the blacksmith shop up in this area. So there are two different blacksmithing operations going on, and what we need to figure out is how they differ based on the artifacts. So that's what we're analyzing right now. And then the final site that we excavated was the Burns site, which is a completely different site that appears to be a tobacco barn dating to the 1820s. And this is the site where you'll remember we've got the burn trenches. And when the final analysis, we were able to figure out these burn trenches line up. And they appear to, you can see it a bit up in this shot right here. There's three of these squared off areas that might form a 3-bay tobacco barn. And this is something we're still assessing right now. And actually the interns, Nathaniel, Emily, Becca, Jennifer, and Lizzie are all writing up these sites with Chris. And they're going to be delivering a paper at the Mid-Atlantic Archaeology Conference in about 2 weeks, and we're going to be holding a lunch and learn on those, not next week, but the week after next. So when you see the interns next week, give them sympathy because they're stressed out right now about getting ready to deliver papers at the MAC conference. So, but so what I wanted to go over tonight was, giving you a bigger context for Montpelier, of course, but then zooming in on these 3 sites that you're going to be processing artifacts from next week, doing iron conservation, doing some photography of artifacts. But then what Mary really wants to do with this lab program is really show, not just what happens with the artifacts in the lab, how we conserve them, but where these artifacts oftentimes end up and why we do the conservation. In some cases, it's to do the conservation so we can put the artifacts on exhibit. In other cases, it's doing the conservation so 20 years from now, maybe when we're having my retirement party, we still have artifacts in storage that aren't just a pile of rusty, flaky metal, but they're objects that we can continue to conserve and look at and analyze as the years go by. But so that's where these artifacts are going to be coming from that you all are going to be looking at next week, and wanted to open it up for any kind of questions or comments y'all might have.
Matt, I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about the time period between the Madisons and the DuPonts.
Yeah.
So the house was purchased by one person or multiple people, and why did they allow it to decline?
Just the economics of it. It was owned by about 6 different owners between when Dolly Madison sold it and the DuPonts purchased it. There are a total of 8, but there's 6 that have an impact on the occupation. And really, it's a more of a the reason why the plantation goes into decline is it's more a matter of in the region there is an overall decline in any kind of farming operations. First, before the Civil War, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, what Virginia plantations were doing is no longer raising crops. They were essentially raising people, having slaves reproduce and then sell those individuals to the Deep South for the cotton production that was happening in the New South. And so what happens at Montpelier is fairly typical of the Virginia Piedmont in terms of plantation sizes getting much smaller and no longer having the large economic output. And of course, with no economic output, it means there's less money, more debt. And for Montpelier, the size of Montpelier goes from over 100 individuals down to about 25, and from 5,000 contiguous acres down to about 1,800 acres. And it's the DuPonts are the ones who put the land mass back together, and all into the 20th century, with the end of slavery, most of these farms, are further subdivided. And it's not until the 20th century that a lot of these areas start to be bought by wealthier people and made into horse farms. And the DuPonts are a classic example of this. They buy Montpelier not to be a working farm, but make it into more of a country estate. And during the 20th century, that's what allows a lot of the preservation to happen at Montpelier. So it's a larger economic, cycle that's happening all across Virginia, Ron. It's not particular to Montpelier. And also for Montpelier, there was no real interest. There wasn't the same level of interest about Madison as there was with Jefferson and Washington, because he just wasn't, didn't promote himself the way those two did. And Washington, of course, is the father of the U.S. of the founding of America. Jefferson was this extremely dynamic individual where he's literally creating his legacy through he designs the tomb and the obelisk that's above him. In contrast, Madison dies and is buried in an unmarked grave for the first 20 years of his being buried. And that's to his own design. You know, he didn't want to be memorialized the way Jefferson and Madison did. So, or Jefferson and Washington were. So it's, you know, combination of the personal politics of these people, and then also the decline of these plantations. So like Jefferson's Monticello was in horrible shape when you get into the 1920s. And it was only, you know, the formation of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation that led to the restoration of that. Washington's home was in equal disrepair, but the ladies of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, they began memorialization of Washington in the 1850s. So Washington is barely cold in his grave when they're looking to begin to restore Mount Vernon, but it's a long time before they're able to, you know, get it to a state where visitors can come and see it. It's more kind of like people would go to Mount Vernon and, you know, they would visit and then take a hammer and take a little swipe at the tomb to take a sample of the tomb back home with them. So there's a different form of memorialization happening in the 19th century. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, but looking forward to seeing you all next week. And we're gonna wanted to give you this, you know, some of this background lecture so that you'd have something to begin to think about, and also just a chance to see everybody before you get here to make sure you didn't have any questions or concerns about arrival. So, and I think Melissa, you've got all the numbers for the dinner for Sunday night.
I do. We're good.
Okay, sounds good there, Melissa. So, well, if no one has anything else to add, we could go ahead and sign off for tonight. If you need anything, you know, drop Melissa a line. She's checking the dig email to see what you all need. And we'll look forward to seeing you all on Sunday night. I'm actually not going to be at the Sunday night dinner. My son and his girlfriend are in town, and I'm going to be making Jamaican chicken for them and my brother, who's coming over to see them before they head out.
We're all going over to Matt's.
Oh, yeah, well, there'll be plenty of Jamaican chicken. You'll have to fight my brother for it. He loves that Jamaican chicken, so.
I can take him.
I'm sure you can do it.
She could. She's tough.
Yeah, just had a root canal this afternoon, doing real good.
Oh no, well, you need something more than Jamaican chicken. You need some Jamaican rum. So
Yeah. Definitely.
well, all right, everybody, well, good seeing you all tonight. And I will be in touch and look forward to seeing you all on Monday morning. But you all will see each other on Sunday night. So
Yeah.
all right.
Okay,
Bye, everybody.
Bye, folks.
Have a good
All
week.
Sunday.
Take care. See y'all soon.
Bye.
Bye.